All right, so we're looking at chapter 13, the old regime, absolutism and enlightenment. Uh, Part one, chapter 13 is going to go over the commercial revolution and the rise of capitalism. So the essential questions for this chapter, for the entire chapter, what were the effects of the commercial revolution, or what did the effects of the commercial revolution have on people's standards of living? In other words, the things that they had, the material things that they had, how did that change? How did Europe's rulers achieve absolute power? How did the scientific revolution change people's view of the natural world? And the last one, how modern was the Enlightenment? Here is a map of the time, the different colonies that had already been set up. What we're going to look at is how it really enriched the Europeans and how the Europeans viewed their colonies. So, commercial revolution. So, although most of Europe remained agricultural during this period, so most were still farmers, the fastest growing part of the European economy was in the trade of goods, especially those manufactured in Europe, so made in Europe and brought in from Asia and the Americas. Commercial revolution marked an important step in the transition of Europe from the local economies of the Middle Ages to the formation of a truly global economy. The commercial revolution had the following aspects: it had global trade, had mercantilism, and the emergence of free enterprise. And this is kind of what we have talked about as the triangular trade. So, raw materials coming into Europe, manufactured goods going into Africa, uh, enslaved Africans coming into the Caribbean, and then eventually into the southern colonies. So this is kind of how the mother countries felt, uh, what the colonies were actually supposed to do. Pretty much just serve the mother country. So with raw materials, foodstuffs, gold, and silver. So global trade, people began producing more goods for sale rather than for their own use. So you had an extra, you had a surplus. Trade increased as sugar, rice, tobacco, and precious metals were shipped from the Americas into Europe. Ming China exported silks and porcelain, while India exported tea. The East Indies produced spices, and Africa provided enslaved workers. Europe exported wool and cloth, lumber, and finished goods. And you can see all the different trade that's now happening with colonies and how a lot of it was set up. Just like we had with the triangular trade. Here's another map of the triangular trade. But one of the things we didn't focus on so much in class is all the trade that was also going on in the East. And here's a good map of pretty much everything is going on at that time. And the main players were the British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. So mercantilism, wealth equals power. So European kings hoped to increase their power through the system of mercantilism. Mercantilists acted to remove trade barriers within their country. They also taught that wealth and power were based on amassing gold and silver, which could be used to pay soldiers to defend the state. Mercantilists thought that the total wealth in the world was limited. So that was going to be it. Once you had gathered all this wealth, that was going to be it. So that it had to be gained through war or trade. For this purpose, France, England, and Holland established overseas colonies in imitation of Spain. Each European mother country exported finished goods to its colonists in exchange for less costly raw materials. This was supposed to lead to the flow of money back to the mother country. The competition for colonial empires led to a series of wars between major European powers. In the 1600s, England attacked Holland to take control of major shipping routes. In the 1700s, England and France fought a series of wars on land and at sea for control of North America and India. So this is kind of how the Europeans viewed mercantilism. You wanted to have more exports, so more stuff that you were selling, and bring in fewer imports from other places. So really, the colonies would supply gold, silver, fur, lumber, foodstuff to the mother country. Mother country would then turn all these items into finished goods in factories, and sell those back to the colonies. And of course, it's going to be more expensive when it's sold back to the colonies. So mercantilism is a new economic policy, and really you have the founding of the colonies. You have new goods in Europe led to significant changes in Europe. In the 1500s, Europeans developed new economic policy called mercantilism. Nation strength depended on its wealth. Wealthy nations had power for military and expanded influence, but there was, of course, a intense competition. So wealth was measured by the amount of gold, silver that a country could possess. Mercantilists believed there was a fixed amount of wealth in the world. For one nation to become wealthier and more powerful, it had to take the wealth from another country. So mercantilism led to intense competition between nations. And here's some of the different navigation acts that were enforced on the colonies. Like it says here, don't export any hats, woolen, or iron, since these are already made in England. So things that were made in England, the colonies were not supposed to make these and export them because that would hurt the English economy. You can't export anything except on English or colonial ships. So even though it might have been cheaper to send it on a Spanish ship, you had to use English or colonial ships. The tobacco is all going to be pretty much sent to England, and take that cargo into England to be taxed before you land in the colonies. So different items had to be taxed in England, so they made their money before they got to the colonies. The emergence of free enterprise. So merchants and bankers laid the foundations for the free enterprise system known as capitalism today. Under this system, business owners risk their capital or money in a business in order to make profits. The growth of the new businesses like weaving cloth, processing food stuff, forging ironwares, building ships led to a demand for huge sums of money. Money was needed to pay for facilities, shipyards, things like that, and materials used in manufacturing or international trade. Ships had to be insured because there was a high risk of loss from accidents, stormy weather, or war. And European rulers also needed money to buy equipment to hire troops to wage war. So there's a mad rush to get as much money as you possibly can. So the emergence of free enterprise. To raise these large sums, the first joint stock companies were formed. So like our stock exchange. These ventures were privately owned companies that sold stock to investors. Investors bought the stock for a share of the profit. The accumulation of capital by these companies allowed the purchase of large amounts of raw material or equipment such as ships. So these private companies sold their stock, which is really you're selling part of your company to raise large amounts of money. That way they could actually use this large amount of money to build more ships or buy raw materials or the different things that they needed to do. Banks also developed new ways of raising and lending money. Some governments issued funds that were sold to the public. The government then paid interest to the purchasers of these funds. Eventually, those become like bonds, wartime bonds, and things like that later on. So you start to have your first stocks. These are actually you're actually buying part of the company, hoping that company is going to do well, and you're going to end up getting more money in the end. So the rise of capitalism. Increasing trade between Europe and the colonies created new businesses and trade practices during the 1500s and 1600s. These practices would have a great impact on the economies of the European nations. Capitalism emerges. In capitalism, most economic activity carried on by private individuals or organizations in order to seek profit. During this time, capitalism expanded. Overseas trade, which we already saw. Individuals amassed great trade fortunes. Merchants supplied colonists with European goods, and also you had return products and raw materials that were sent to Europe. Increased business activity. Overseas trade made many merchants rich. Wealth enabled them to invest in more business ventures, which allowed them sometimes to become even wealthier, and business activities in Europe increased greatly. The emergence of free enterprise. This financial revolution enabled some governments to raise large sums of money to expand their armies and navies. Bankers and merchants became more influential in government. In Holland, rich merchants were able to establish an oligarchy, which is a government ruled by a few, okay? And most of the time, those are going to be wealthy people. As a result of the commercial revolution, Europeans had more products from which to choose. They could enjoy tea, sugar, coffee, cotton clothes, and other goods. There were more books and new forms of learning and entertainment, such as theater groups, newspapers, and schools. This led to more choices in occupants as well as consumption, in occupations as well as consumption. These advances led to the rising standard of living for many Europeans.